She walked into school every morning with her head down, not because she was shy, but because she had learned, painfully, that looking up only made things worse. The whispers, the laughter, the cruel jokes, they followed her everywhere. Her name was Emily, small town, quiet girl, and for some reason she became the favorite target of her classmates. They called her names, they ruined her homework, they made sure she knew every single day that she didn't belong. But one day, Emily was gone. Not just skipping class, not just avoiding school. She disappeared. Her locker, left untouched. Her desk, empty. Her home, silent. At first, people barely noticed. The teachers assumed she was sick. A few kids joked that maybe she finally ran away like she always threatened to. But then, days turned into weeks, and the whispers changed. Where did she go? Why did she leave? Did someone do something to her? The town, once indifferent, started to panic. Search parties were formed, flyers were printed, police questioned students, teachers, even her parents, who barely spoke to anyone. But there were no answers, no clues, no goodbye note. It was like she had been erased from existence. And then, years later, when most people had finally stopped asking questions, when her name had become just another ghost story in the hallways, Emily came back. But she wasn't the same. And the truth she carried? It was darker than anyone could have imagined. The day she returned, everything stopped. Emily walked into town like a shadow from the past, her face older but unmistakable. People turned, stared, whispered her name as if saying it out loud would make her vanish again. At the grocery store, a woman dropped her bag of apples. A former classmate, now working the register, went pale. And then, just as quickly as the news spread, the questions came flooding back. Where had she been? Why had she left? And most importantly, why now? Her parents, once silent and withdrawn, barely recognized her. Her mother trembled as she reached out, as if afraid she might be touching a ghost. Her father stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes clouded with something between disbelief and guilt. But Emily? She barely reacted, no tears, no smiles, just a quiet, unsettling calm. The town wanted answers. The police reopened the case, reporters knocked on doors. But Emily refused to speak. Not at first. Then one evening, sitting in a cold, dimly lit interrogation room, she finally whispered 4 words that sent a chill through the entire town. "You let it happen." The detective leaned in. "What do you mean, Emily?" "What happened to you?" Silence. Then she looked up, her eyes empty, hollow, like someone who had lived through something no one else could understand. And she told them, piece by piece, detail by detail. And by the time she was done, the town realized that Emily's story wasn't just about bullying. It was about something far worse, something hidden, something ignored, something no one wanted to admit. And the worst part? The people who should have protected her were the same ones who turned away when she needed them the most. The room was deathly silent. The detective, a man who had seen it all, runaways, crime, even murder, felt his throat tighten. Emily wasn't just telling a story, she was unraveling a nightmare. It started small, the bullying, the whispers, the pranks. But there was something more, something deeper. There were nights she'd come home with bruises she couldn't explain, not from fists, from hands that gripped too tightly, from someone who wanted to make sure she kept quiet, someone she trusted, someone no one would suspect. Emily's hands trembled as she spoke, not out of fear, but out of rage. She had tried to tell someone before, a teacher, a counselor, even her own parents. They all gave her the same look, the same rehearsed words. "You're overreacting." Kids are mean. Try to ignore it. But how do you ignore someone who follows you home, How do you ignore someone who knows exactly when your parents leave for work? How do you ignore someone who whispers threats in your ear while everyone else pretends they hear nothing? She was 14 when she realized no one was coming to save her. So she did the only thing she could. She disappeared. Not kidnapped, not lost. She ran. She found a way out, hitchhiking, sleeping in bus stations, doing whatever it took to survive. And every night, as she lay awake in unfamiliar places, she repeated the same words to herself. They let it happen. The people who should have helped her, the ones who could have stopped it, the ones who knew but chose silence. And now, she was back. Not for closure, not for sympathy. She was back for justice. And she wasn't leaving until the truth was known. The town had spent years burying the past, pretending Emily never existed, pretending they never heard the rumors. But now she was standing in front of them, demanding answers. The detective leaned forward, voice low. "Emily, who was it?" For the first time since she walked into that room, she hesitated. Not because she was afraid, but because she wanted them to feel the weight of what she was about to say. And then she spoke the name. A name that sent shockwaves through the entire town. It wasn't a classmate, it wasn't some stranger lurking in the dark. It was a man they all knew, a respected man, a trusted man, someone who had been there all along, the school principal, Mr. Calloway, the man who was supposed to protect the students, the man who gave speeches about bullying, about kindness, about safety, the man who told Emily, when she came to his office in tears, that she was just too sensitive. But behind closed doors, he was the reason she ran. The detective's face went pale. He had heard stories before, whispers from other girls, complaints that mysteriously disappeared, but no one ever spoke out. Until now. Emily wasn't just telling her story. She was setting fire to every lie the town had told itself. The police reopened the case. Mr. Calloway denied everything. The town was split, some in shock, others in denial. But then more voices started speaking up. Other girls. Other stories. The truth had been there all along. It just needed someone brave enough to drag it into the light. And Emily. She had spent years being ignored, years being silenced, but now the world was finally listening. And she wasn't done yet. As the weeks passed, the town began to unravel. The principal, Mr. Calloway, who had once been a figure of authority and respect, now stood at the center of a storm that threatened to destroy everything he had built. The police uncovered more evidence. Other victims came forward, girls who had been too afraid to speak, too intimidated by his position, his charm, his influence. It was a pattern, a cycle of manipulation. Mr. Calloway had preyed on their vulnerabilities, their fears, their quiet moments when they thought they were safe. He used his power to control, to threaten, to silence. And he did it all under the guise of authority. But Emily wasn't finished yet. With each new voice that joined her cause, the truth spread faster than the town could deny it. The media arrived, stories were published, and the small town that had once lived in denial found itself forced to confront the darkness it had allowed to thrive. And it wasn't just about Emily anymore. It was about every girl who had ever felt invisible, every person who had suffered in silence, waiting for someone to listen. Emily became their voice, but not everyone was ready to accept the truth. Some people still refused to believe it. They clung to their image of Mr. Calloway, the man they had admired, the man they trusted. To them, the idea that he could be anything other than the perfect educator seemed impossible. But the evidence didn't lie, and as the trial began, more horrifying details emerged. Emily's disappearance, once considered a mystery, was now understood for what it truly was: a desperate escape. An act of survival. And when the judge finally read the verdict, when Mr. Calloway was sentenced for his crimes, the town was forever changed. Not because justice was served, but because they realized how much they had ignored, how much they had let slip through their fingers because it was easier to turn a blind eye. Emily's return had exposed not just one man's cruelty, but an entire community's failure to act. But even with the town in shock and the truth now laid bare, Emily didn't feel victorious. She wasn't fighting for revenge. She wasn't fighting for recognition. She was fighting for something far bigger. She was fighting for every silent cry, for every ignored plea, for every girl who had been told she was overreacting, for every person who had been told their pain wasn't real. Because in the end, Emily had done more than expose a dark truth. She had sparked a change, a revolution of sorts. She wasn't just a victim, she was a warrior, and her fight wasn't over.